Teddy Sanders' office, Johnson Space Center, Houston, Texas. Mindy sat at the conference table in the director of NASA's office, tapping her fingertips in rhythm against her knee while she waited for the meeting to start. Now that Johansson and Watney were spending time outside the hab again, she'd been called back up to the big leagues and her presence was once again required at the interdepartmental update meetings. It was hardly her first time in attendance, and nobody thought twice about her being there, but she still couldn't help feeling grossly outranked every time she sat at a table with the upper echelon of NASA personnel. She thought she was doing a good job concealing her anxiety, but when Venkat reached out underneath the table and stilled her hand, giving it a reassuring pat before pulling his back so he could continue to scroll through the information on the tablet in front of him, she knew she wasn't as self-contained as she had been hoping. "Sorry I'm late," Annie apologized, as she blew into the room. She didn't bother looking up as she typed away furiously on her phone as she made her way to her usual seat. "I was reconfirming that the public hasn't figured out they dug up the RTG. But other than that, public support remains strong and the ratings for the Martian report continue to be an all-time high for CNN. Have I mentioned how much I love having all the major news networks sucking up to me for once?" she said with an almost predatory grin. In her tenure of director of media for NASA, she was more accustomed to having to wheel and deal to keep the space program in the mainstream news. She didn't love the circumstances, but she adored the position of power it afforded her. "They all want an exclusive. Franklin over at the BBC keeps sending me flowers." "Maybe he just enjoys your sunny disposition," Mitch drawled sarcastically. "Maybe he wants a date, not an exclusive." Annie scoffed. "Fuck that, I'd rather give him an exclusive. I'm already paying alimony to 2 deadbeat ex-husbands, I'm not looking for a third." Mitch laughed as Teddy rose from personal desk and crossed to join the others at the conference table. "As thrilling as this conversation is," Teddy said, taking his seat at the head of the table, "can we focus on the relevant portion? There's been no talk about the RTG. None," Annie reiterated. "We're obligated to release the photos, not to offer our analysis. We framed it as just another incremental test of the modified rover and no one has contested that." "Excellent." Teddy turned his attention to Venkat. "Do we have any idea why they dug it up in the first place?" "Heat, I think," Venkat answered. "Aren't we going to wait for Bruce?" he asked, looking up at the flat screen on the wall where Bruce usually video conferenced from JPL with the rest of the Pasadena team. "Scheduling conflict," Teddy explained. "But his last email assured me JPL is keeping up on their end with the supply probe. Now why would they need the RTG for heat? They're obviously prepping the rover to make long trips. It uses a lot of energy just to keep warm," Venkat reasoned logically. "The RTG will heat up the rover without draining the battery. It's an ingenious idea, really." "How dangerous is that, really?" Annie asked, attempting to gauge the potential fallout if the public did figure out what Mark and Beth were doing in those pictures. "I don't really need astronauts use deadly radioactive waste as portable space heater," as tomorrow's headline. "It's not dangerous at all, as long as the capsule remains intact. Even if it didn't, they'll still be okay as long as the pellets inside don't break open also," Venkat said. "But if those break too, they're done for." "Fantastic," Annie said sarcastically. "We'll just have to hope that doesn't happen," Teddy said before turning his attention to Mindy. "Miss Park, can you please give us a quick overview on what Johansson and Watney have been up to this week?" "Of course," Mindy responded quickly, glancing down at her notes. She wasn't sure exactly why she needed to since everyone in the room was CC'd on her far more detailed daily update emails, but she did as she was asked. On Sol 61, they removed the battery from Rover 1 and created a sling out of hab canvas to attach it to Rover 2. They also removed 14 panels from the solar farm and attached them to the roof. On Sol 62, they drove in circles around the hab for almost 2 hours, presumably to test the modifications on the rover. Sol 63, they drove the 4 kilometers out to the RTG, dug it up, and drove back to the hab. They spent several more hours that day inside the rover while parked at the hab, performing some unknown modifications inside the cab. Then, on Sol 64, they left the hab at sunrise, drove for 2 hours in circles around the hab, stopped, did an EVA, we think to switch the batteries, and then drove for another 2 hours. They then did another EVA to set up the solar panels, waited 12 hours and then drove directly back to the hab. Yesterday, they didn't leave the hab at all other to take what we think was one of the hab's oxygen tanks and several other storage containers out to the rover. Thank you, Miss Park, Teddy said. So they're obviously preparing for a longer journey, but where do they think they're going? Oz-4, Mitch said simply. Where else could they go? They don't know about the plans to modify the MDV, so they are operating under the assumption that they are going to have to get themselves there eventually. But why would they go now? Teddy asked. They have to know that there's nothing there yet. Maybe they are bored, Mitch smirked. It's not like they have much else to do. The MAV is there, Venkat pointed out, ignoring Mitch's comment. If they can get to that, they could communicate with us directly. They know we're watching them, Annie interjected. They've proven that by changing their messages. They have to know that we're doing everything possible to help them. Would they really risk going however far it is? 3,200 kilometers, Mindy supplied. Just to have a conversation. I hope not, Teddy sighed. But what if they do? We could always land the pre-supply there, Venkat offered. But that's still a year out. I don't know how they would survive there until then. If they are planning on going to Oz-4, how long would it take them to get there? Teddy asked, massaging his temples. Venkat turned to Mindy and they quickly conferred in soft voices. 3,200 kilometers. Traveling 4 hours a day. Closer to 3.5, and that's in Acidolia Planitia where it's flat. There's a lot of terrain on the way to Schiaparelli. Only 80 kilometers a sol, on a good day. Venkat did some silent math. At least 40 days, but most likely more. 40 days of 2 people living inside the rover. Teddy shook his head in disbelief. Is that even possible? They'd have to turn it into a mobile hab. Venkat shrugged. He supposed it was possible, but it wouldn't be easy or comfortable. They'd need the oxygenator, the water reclaimer and the atmospheric regulator, to survive that long in a rover. Have you seen anything to indicate they might be moving those to the rover? Teddy asked. No sir, Mindy answered. Other than a single oxygen tank, nothing like that. Teddy sighed again. Then we have to hope they've got the sense to stay put. He spoke directly to Mindy once more. Keep an eye on them, let me know immediately if they start driving anywhere but aimlessly around the hab. Yes sir, she nodded, as if she would have done anything but that. All right, I think that's it for now. Without Bruce's usual update on JPL's progress, the meeting was much shorter than usual. Unless anyone has anything else to add. Annie shook her head. Everything was solid and stable on the media front, and she was already halfway out of her chair when Mitch spoke. Yeah. I've got something, the flight director said. When are we going to tell the crew? There was an almost unanimous sigh, and a few rolled eyes from those gathered around the table. Teddy pinched the bridge of his nose. We've been over this, Mitch. Well, I want to go over it again, Mitch stated. It's been months, Teddy. Morale is not improving on Hermes. And we've already discussed all the reasons that the crew is best left in the dark, Venkat interjected. No, you've discussed it. I've never once agreed with you, and I'm telling you that the crew will be better off knowing, Mitch insisted. It's cruel keeping them in the dark like this. You said weeks ago that we'd tell them once we have a viable rescue plan. We have one. We have plans on top of plans. Mindy didn't even realize she was nodding her agreement, until the flight director called her out on it. Mindy agrees with me. I don't really want to get in the middle of this, she said quickly, glancing at a frowning Venkat, whose attention had snapped to her when Mitch drew her into the conversation. But I'd want to know, if I was them, she admitted. Miss Park has no authority on this decision, Teddy replied. Mindy sank down in her chair. However, Mitch wasn't deterred. The longer we wait, the worse their reaction is going to be. It's going to be bad enough when they find out that we only thought they were dead for 10 days, while they've believed their crewmates have been dead for 2 months. If we keep holding out on them, they are going to stage a bloody mutiny when we do tell them. There's no need for dramatics, Mitch, Teddy said, exasperated. They are professionals, they are not going to mutiny. Mitch opened his mouth to continue his argument, but Teddy cut him off. Once the probe launches, and we know that they are not going to starve to death, we'll tell the crew. And I don't want to hear anything more about it today. That's all for now, you're all dismissed. Mitch stomped out of the room ahead of everyone else, grumbling under his breath, "I still don't like this." Sol 66. "I still don't like this," Beth said, not for the first time, as she watched Mark go over his checklist one last time before leaving the hab, as he prepared to depart on his solo road trip to Pathfinder. "I know you don't, but it's the perfect dry run for when we both have to make the trek to Schiaparelli crater," he told her, also not for the first time. "Yeah, but at least then we'll be together. I don't like the idea of you all the way out there by yourself. If something happens I won't even be able to come and get you, because you're taking the battery from the second rover with you," she said with a frown, her arms wrapped around her middle. "But the rover's life support systems won't be able to support the both of us for a trip this long with bringing the oxygenator, atmospheric regulator and water reclaimer, and I don't want to pull any of those out of the hab until we absolutely have to. Not to mention that the plants need them," he reminded her, gently. He knew she was only so anxious because she cared. "And besides, I'm a mechanic, remember? If something breaks, I'll fix it," he said with a charm-filled grin. Beth sighed heavily. She knew he was right. They'd spent the last 2 days doing nothing but planning this trip. They'd pored over terrain maps to plot out the best course to Pathfinder and the best way to navigate it. They ran all the numbers to make sure he would have enough oxygen, co-filters, food and water to make the 20-day journey. They thought about potential problems he might face and brainstormed on how best to solve them. They had gone over the plan backwards and forwards. This is what made the most sense. The batteries were charged, the solar panels secured, the supplies were all loaded up, he was all ready to go. But it didn't mean she had to like it. "You know I'm going to go absolutely crazy being stuck here by myself with nothing to do for the next 3 weeks. You'll have plenty to do," he countered brightly. "After all, who else is going to care for our potato children?" "Okay. 1. Please don't call our only renewable food source our children," she told him, shaking her head. "It opens up all kinds of creepy doors that I don't want to think about." "And 2, what if I fuck something up and kill them all while you're gone?" she asked, genuinely concerned. Mark brought his hands up to rest on Beth's shoulders. "You're not going to kill them. We won't need to harvest again until after I get back, and they are pretty self-sufficient in the meantime," he reassured her. "All you need to do is keep breathing, so you give them carbon dioxide to absorb, make sure the tubers stay covered in dirt, and water them just like I taught you. They are hardy plants, you and they are going to be fine." "I once accidentally killed a potted bamboo plant," she admitted flatly. "What? Really?" he asked, legitimately taken aback by this information. "And on a completely separate occasion, I killed a potted cactus," she added. She could actually see Mark's brain stutter as he tried to comprehend this. "How? I don't know," Beth exclaimed, throwing up her hands. "But after a while I wasn't allowed to house sit for my grandma anymore, because every time she came back from vacation all her houseplants were dead. She said I had the brownest thumb she'd ever known. I excel at many things in this world," she said plainly, not bragging, just stating the truth. "Gardening is not one of them." "Okay. Then maybe you can just watch over our potato children," he said, warily. "From outside the tub. You know, just make sure they don't have any rowdy parties while Dad's not home." Beth laughed and rolled her eyes. "You're ridiculous, and they're not our children." "Shush, don't say that where they can hear you. You'll give them a complex. They are still young and impressionable." "Don't worry, little potatoes, she doesn't mean it," he called over his shoulder towards their little farm, while he put on the gloves to his Eva suit. "Be good for your mother while I'm gone." "I take back everything I said," she said, shaking her head as she picked up his helmet. "I'm glad you're going by yourself. I'm not going to miss you at all." "That's a lie," Mark replied confidently. "Yeah, it is," she sighed, crossing over to stand in front of him so she could help him with his helmet. Mark leaned down to make it easier for her to reach over his head, but Beth took advantage of his proximity and stood on her toes to plant a soft kiss to his mouth. "For good luck," she whispered against his lips. Taken by surprise, Mark only blinked at her before Beth's cheeks colored with embarrassment at her own impulsiveness. "That was stupid. Don't tell anyone I did that," she muttered, not making eye contact as she slipped the helmet over his head and busied herself with making sure the latches were engaged properly. "Fuck that," he replied quickly. If I run into Marvin the Martian out there, the first thing I'm gonna do is tell him all about the hot super nerd action I just got. Beth once again rolled her eyes at him, but she didn't look embarrassed anymore, so he considered it a job well done. He pulled her helmet off its shelf and helped her into it, just as she'd done for him. She insisted on going outside to see him off, and refused to be dissuaded, and so once they were both fully suited up, they stepped into the airlock. Beth stood by and watched while Mark did one last walk around the modified rover, making sure the panels he'd borrowed from the solar farm were securely fastened and the saddlebag with the second battery was correctly balanced, before he walked back over to her to say their final goodbyes. "You remembered to pack your toothbrush and extra clean underwear?" she asked teasingly. "You wouldn't want to get in an accident and be embarrassed because you're not wearing clean underwear." Mark laughed. "I'll drive extra careful, I wouldn't want to get a ticket. We still don't know what the Martian to dollar exchange rate is, but I bet it would be expensive." "Don't get yourself into any trouble while I'm not there to bail you out of it," she told him, throwing a playful punch to his shoulder. "I should be telling you that," Mark retorted. "Out of the two of us, who has been questioned by Homeland Security?" Beth smiled, but it didn't completely reach her eyes. "Stay safe out there," she said, more seriously. "I will," he replied solemnly. "And you stay safe here." "I will," she echoed. "Good." He took a step forward and pulled her in for a hug. It was awkward in their bulky and unwieldy suits, but the sentiment was there, and that's what counted. "I'm going to be fine," he assured again before letting go. "Because why?" "Because fuck Mars, that's why," Beth replied, giving the now familiar call and response. "Damn straight," he agreed, giving her one last squeeze before releasing her. It only took Mark a few minutes to swing up into the rover, wait for the airlock to cycle, strip out of the top half of his EVA suit, and then he was on his way. The rover was already becoming smaller on the horizon when Mark's voice came over the comm. "Hey Johansson. Is everything okay, Watney?" she asked, concern tinging her voice. She knew Mark well enough to hear the underlying anxiety in his tone. "Yeah. I was just wondering if is there anything else you want me to pick up while I'm out running errands?" he asked, trying to keep things light, as he got further and further from the relative safety of the hab. Beth chuckled and played along. "Well, if you could stop at the store and pick up a dozen eggs and a gallon of milk, that would be great." "Eggs and milk," he repeated back. "Anything else?" "And stop at the cleaners on your way back and pick up the dry cleaning. I think it's way overdue." Mark laughed. "You got it." "Hey Beth." "Yeah Mark." He didn't saying for a long moment and she wondered if maybe he had passed out of the comms range. "Mark," she prompted again. "Keep the home fires burning for me, will ya? I'll even put a candle in the window so you can find your way back." "Awesome, you can, Pathfinder, potatoes." He was cutting out, she was hearing more static than words. "Watney," she called back. "Watney." "Mark." But he was out of range. She stood outside the hab until she could no longer see the rover, even as a white speck on the red Martian horizon. And for the first time, they were both truly alone on Mars. Teddy